In the remote, tangled heart of the Ozark Hills, far from paved roads and polite society, there once stood a house that seemed to breathe its own darkness. Inside lived a man who carried himself like a monarch. His word was law, his gaze a silent decree. But this was no fairy tale kingdom. His crown was not forged in gold, but in silence so heavy it crushed the spirit, in shame so deep it swallowed generations, and in bloodlines twisted far too close for comfort. The locals spoke his name in whispers, as if saying it too loud might stir something sleeping beneath the earth. His story was not written in books. It was etched into the land, into the bones of those who survived him. Even now, decades later, the soil here is said to carry his legacy, a stain that no rain can wash away, and no time can truly bury. The Ozark Hills, rolling ridges and deep valleys, where mist curls low to the earth, like it's hiding something. In the early morning, the world here is painted in shades of gray, not just from the fog, but from the weight of history clinging to the air. This is a place where beauty and dread coexist, where the wind carries the scent of pine and the ghost of unspoken stories. Locals will tell you the Ozarks have always been a place apart, cut off by their own wild geography, where families settle deep in the hollers and seldom venture far. Roads here twist like old veins, sometimes ending abruptly at a fence, a creek, or a forgotten gate. And when you live far from the outside world, sometimes the rules of that world stop applying. Among these hills, the story begins with a man who seemed to command his own realm. A patriarch, tall, gaunt, eyes like storm clouds that people in town learned not to cross. Some claimed he rarely smiled, others that his smile meant danger. His voice was slow and deliberate, every word weighed before leaving his mouth. But what truly set him apart, what made his story echo across decades, was not the way he ruled over his kin. It was the way his family tree bent inward. In the whispered accounts, the truth is both simple and monstrous. He fathered children with his own sister. Not once, not twice, but enough times that his name became synonymous with the kind of family secrets no one dared speak aloud in public. In the nearest towns, you wouldn't find his face in the newspaper, but you might find the shadow of his reputation lingering in every hushed conversation. People called it keeping to their own. But here, their own meant something far more literal. It said the first time someone from outside the hollow learned the truth, they didn't believe it until they looked at the children. There was something about them, not in the way they acted, but in their eyes. The way they seemed to avoid meeting a stranger's gaze for too long. The way they stuck close together, like they were bound by more than just blood. To this day, the cabin where they lived stands abandoned. Its wooden boards are warped with rot, the front door swinging open and shut with the wind, creaking like it's trying to speak. Inside, the walls hold the smell of damp earth and something metallic faint, but enough to raise the hair on your neck. Before he was a feared patriarch, he was just a boy. A boy raised in the kind of isolation that turns the outside world into a rumor. His earliest memories were of the creak of the cabin floorboards, the hiss of the wood stove, and the slow drip of rain leaking through the roof during spring storms. The Ozark Hills weren't just home, they were the boundaries of his entire universe. The nearest town was half a day's ride on horseback, and visits there were rare, only for supplies his father couldn't grow, hunt, or trade for. Strangers were not welcome in the hollow, and his parents made sure he understood that. Outsiders brought trouble, disease, greed, judgment. That was the lesson repeated at the dinner table, in the garden, by the fire at night. And so his world became small, but complete in its own way. There was a creek that ran behind the cabin, its water cold and clear, even in summer, where he caught minnows in glass jars. There was the old oak whose branches he climbed until the whole hollow spread beneath him like a private kingdom. But, above all else, there was his sister. She was just 1 year younger, and in that place, in that life, she was more than family. She was his only companion, his only friend, his shadow. They learned the same lessons, spoke the same dialect of half-whispered words, and shared the same sense that the rest of the world was something distant and faintly dangerous. It started as innocent closeness games by the creek, swapping secrets whispered under the quilt on cold nights. But the older they grew, the more that closeness changed into something neither of them could name. There were no other children to compare themselves to, no rules from the outside world to measure against. They had no one but each other. And so the boundary between sibling and something else began to blur. On the table in their cabin sat a single, leather-bound Bible, its pages worn thin at the corners from their father's hands. The candlelight would flicker across its surface at night, throwing shadows across the wall. Their parents taught them that sin was real, but the scripture's warnings felt distant, abstract, meant for people far away, in another life, in the hills. They lived by their own scripture, the one written in silence and reinforced by the land that kept them apart from everyone else. By the time he was 19, the boy from the hollow was no longer a boy. He was a father 3 times over. And each child shared not only his blood, but the blood of his sister. In most places, such a truth would tear through a community. Like wildfire. It would bring lawmen to the door, whispers in church pews, the glare of neighbors who pretended not to know your name. But the Ozark Hills were not most places. Here, the land had its own laws, and people had their own reasons to keep quiet. The townsfolk knew. They knew every detail, who belonged to whom, which children looked too much like their uncle, which family kept to themselves for reasons that went beyond shyness. But in these hills, knowledge didn't guarantee action. Fear was the currency here. Fear of a man's temper, fear of a family's vengeance, and a mistrust so deep toward law enforcement that the sheriff might as well have lived on the moon. Those who dared speak about it did so only in the safety of their own kitchens, behind doors locked even in daylight. And even then, they spoke in code. That hollow ain't right, they'd mutter over morning coffee. Or, blood runs close up. There. But no one put it plain, not in public, not where it could be heard by the wrong ears. The patriarch himself walked into town only rarely, a looming figure leaning on a wooden cane, his eyes fixed ahead like he was daring someone to speak. His visits were silent transactions, flour, tobacco, kerosene, paid for in cash, and completed without pleasantries. When he left, conversation only resumed after his boots had vanished down the dirt road. In the local paper, there was once a clipping, tucked between obituaries and livestock ads, bearing the partial headline, "Unfit for the rest," was cut off by the fold, the story itself a mystery. Was it about him, or just a coincidence? In the Ozarks, coincidences were rare. People suspected. People whispered. But no one intervened, because in a place like this, silence wasn't just protection, it was survival. By the time he was 19, the boy from the hollow was no longer a boy. He was a father 3 times over. And each child shared not only his blood, but the blood of his sister. In most places, such a truth would tear through a community. Like wildfire. It would bring lawmen to the door, whispers in church pews, the glare of neighbors who pretended not to know your name. But the Ozark Hills were not most places. Here, the land had its own laws, and people had their own reasons to keep quiet. The townsfolk knew. They knew every detail, who belonged to whom, which children looked too much like their uncle, which family kept to themselves for reasons that went beyond shyness. But in these hills, knowledge didn't guarantee action. Fear was the currency here, fear of a man's temper, fear of a family's vengeance, and a mistrust so deep toward law enforcement that the sheriff might as well have lived on the moon. Those who dared speak about it did so only in the safety of their own kitchens, behind doors locked even in daylight. And even then, they spoke in code. That hollow ain't right, they'd mutter over morning coffee. Or, blood runs close up. There. But no one put it plain, not in public, not where it could be heard by the wrong ears. The patriarch himself walked into town only rarely, a looming figure leaning on a wooden cane, his eyes fixed ahead like he was daring someone to speak. His visits were silent transactions, flour, tobacco, kerosene paid for in cash, and completed without pleasantries. When he left, conversation only resumed after his boots had vanished down the dirt road. In the local paper, there was once a clipping, tucked between obituaries and livestock ads, bearing the partial headline, "Unfit for Vouye." The rest was cut off by the fold, the story itself a mystery. Was it about him, or just a coincidence? In the Ozarks, coincidences were rare. People suspected, people whispered. But no one intervened, because in a place like this, silence wasn't just protection, it was survival. The deeper you go into the Ozark Hills, the more the land seems to fold in on itself, ridge after ridge, valley after valley, until the rest of the world feels like a distant rumor. In those folds, the patriarch's cabin sat like a stubborn shadow, its wood blackened by decades of rain, wind, and unspoken things. Neighbors, those few, whose homes lay within a mile, spoke of nights when the hills carried sounds that didn't belong to coyotes or owls. Strange, drawn-out howls that rose and fell with no rhythm, sometimes followed by a hollow, chest-deep laugh. It was the kind of sound that made people stop mid-step and listen, unsure if it was carried by the wind or something walking just out of sight. Lantern light often appeared in the tree line, drifting slowly between the dark shapes of oaks and pines. The locals swore it wasn't the glow of a hunter or a late-night wanderer. It moved too deliberately, pausing for long stretches as if watching. On some nights, the light would vanish abruptly, as though swallowed whole by the darkness. The children, those pale, barefoot shadows, were sometimes seen wandering the gravel road in the dead of winter, their skin prickled red from the cold, eyes unfocused. No coats, no gloves, just thin nightshirts. When asked, they wouldn't speak. They'd simply turn and walk back toward the cabin, heads low, as if some unseen tether pulled them home. And then there was the man himself. Neighbors noticed something about his eyes, how they rarely blinked for more than a fraction of a second. How they seemed to settle on a person like the barrel of a gun. Even in daylight, even when he spoke in his low, even voice, there was a stillness about him that felt unnatural, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. One story, in particular, lingered in local memory. A traveling peddler claimed he saw the patriarch standing perfectly still in the cabin's upstairs window, just as dawn broke. The man never moved, not even as the peddler loaded his cart and walked away. Hours later, when the peddler returned, past the hollow, the figure was still there, framed in the same pale light, as if time itself had failed to touch and dot in these hills. You didn't need to see something twice to believe it was wrong. Once was enough. By the time the boys were barely into their teens, their bodies had begun to betray them. Their spines bent unnaturally, as if some invisible weight was pulling them down toward the earth. Shoulders hunched, knees bowed, their movements stiff and deliberate. The eldest had a cleft palate that made speech a constant struggle, his words spilling out in broken sounds that only his mother seemed to understand. The youngest's bones fractured with the smallest of accidents, a stumble on the porch steps, a careless fall while chasing the wind. But still, no doctor's carriage ever rolled up the rutted path to the cabin. No medicine bottles clinked on the shelves. The patriarch insisted on keeping the boys hidden from the world's gaze, as though their fragility was a shame to be locked away. Visitors, rare as they were, spoke of glimpsing the children through half-drawn curtains, their thin faces pressed to the glass for only a moment before vanishing into the shadows. The mother, his sister, seemed as much a prisoner as a protector. Gaunt, her cheeks hollowed by years of malnutrition, she defended her brother's choices with a conviction that chilled those who heard her. "Blood is blood," she would say, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through conversation. "It was not affection in her tone, it was doctrine. Some locals believed the boy's conditions were the curse of their bloodline, a punishment for defying the natural order. Others whispered that the father feared outsiders not just for what they might see, but for what they might take. In those hills, children could vanish as easily as livestock, and not every disappearance was the work of a wild animal. One former neighbor recalled a night when the fog rolled in so thick it swallowed the trees. Lanterns glowed dimly in the cabin, but the sound low, rhythmic chanting carried farther than the light. The neighbor swore it was the mother's voice, joined by the deep, unyielding tone of the patriarch, speaking words he could not understand. The sound stopped abruptly when he stepped closer to listen, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed against his chest like a weight. Whatever bound that family together was more than blood. It was secrecy, survival, and something older than either of them would admit. The story of the stranger has been told and retold in the Ozark Hills, always in hushed tones, as though saying too much might summon the wrong kind of attention. It begins on a night when the wind scraped the trees against the cabin walls, and the moon cast long crooked shadows through the branches. The patriarch was sitting in his usual spot, rocking slowly, eyes fixed on the dark woods, when a knock sounded at the door. 3 times, slow, measured. The visitor was a drifter, or so people say. A man who wandered from town to town, carrying little more than the clothes on his back and a voice full of questions. He had been asking about the family in the hills, poking into stories no one dared touch, and somehow he found the cabin. What happened next depends on who you ask. One version claims the patriarch invited him in, offered a seat, and the two spoke in low voices for hours. But by dawn, the stranger was gone, and the forest felt heavier, somehow quieter, as though it were holding its breath. Another version is darker. They say the man never made it past the threshold, that his last sight was the patriarch's unblinking eyes before the door slammed shut. Some locals swear they saw lantern light moving deep into the woods that night. Others claim they found fresh soil near an old oak, a shovel still leaning nearby, as if abandoned mid-task. Then there are the ones who believe something else entirely, that the stranger never died at all, that he was taken in, changed somehow, and now roams the valley after dark, watching, waiting, guarding the cursed bloodline from anyone who dares get too close. Those who believe this say they've seen him just a shape in the trees, unmoving until you blink. And he's gone. No one ever reported him missing. No lawman ever rode up the hill to investigate. In the Ozarks, certain questions are left unanswered for good reason, and the stranger's story? It's one of them. The land where the cabin once stood is bare now, a hollow in the earth where nature has tried and failed to heal itself. Grass grows unevenly here, patches of dirt breaking through like old scars. When the wind moves through the valley, it seems to circle this place, never passing over, as if the air itself is reluctant to touch it. To most outsiders, it's just another forgotten spot in the Ozarks. But to those who live nearby, it is a wound. And wounds remember. Hunters speak of hearing muffled cries drifting through the trees, soft at first, then rising as if someone were calling for help, their voice snagging in the branches. Hikers have sworn that they felt watched from just beyond the tree line, their skin prickling though they could see nothing in the shadows. There are reports, too many to ignore, of a lantern light moving slowly down the hillside on moonless nights, always the same path, as if following a trail only it can see. Those who dare to follow say the light disappears just before reaching the spot where the cabin once stood. The clearing remains empty, but the air feels heavier, like standing in the doorway of a place you should not enter. One hunter's trail camera captured something grainy, unfocused but unmistakable. A tall, thin figure moving between the trees, head bowed, holding a faint glow in one hand. The image was found the next morning, the camera's battery completely drained. And then there's the story of the child's toy half buried in the dirt where the porch once stood. A small wooden horse, its paint worn away, one leg broken. The wind had uncovered it, as if something below wanted it to be found. Locals say the toy belonged to one of the patriarch's sons. They also say whoever took it home moved away within the month, without explanation. To this day, no one stays long in that clearing. It is a place for silence, for shadows, and for the feeling that someone, or something, is still there. Decades after the cabin rotted into the earth, a hunter stumbled across something in the hollow of an old cedar tree wrapped in oilcloth, brittle with age. Inside was a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The ink was faded but legible, and the handwriting uneven. Deliberate, matched the signature on old land deeds, belonging to the patriarch himself. The first entries were mundane weather reports, hunting notes, the births of his sons. But, as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Words became sharper, colder. He wrote of a pure bloodline, one untouched by foreign influence, his meaning as twisted as the trees that hid his home. The diary detailed plans not just for his sister, but for the next generation. His sons, he wrote, were destined to marry their own cousins to keep the root strong and unbroken. The entries grew darker, almost feverish, as if he was writing in the grip of something beyond reason. The margins held strange symbol circles intersected by lines, crude drawings of trees with roots looping back into themselves. Then the last page. A sentence began. "Tomorrow I will prepare the..." and nothing more. The words stopped abruptly, the ink pooling into a dark blot, as though the pen had been torn from his hand. Some say the blot isn't ink at all, that it's darker, thicker, and still faintly sticky even after all these years. The diary now sits locked away in a private collection. The owner refuses to speak about it. But those who have handled it claim they hear faint whispering when the room is silent, voices that seem to come from somewhere just behind them. The patriarch's bloodline may have thinned, his cabin may have crumbled, but his plans, and perhaps his presence, were never truly buried. If the sins of the past still haunt the hills, how long before the earth gives up the rest of its secrets? Subscribe before the next story finds you.